Good morning and welcome to the Institute for Security Studies. Today we will be discussing South Africa's migration policy. In light of the not only recent developments but over the years, the discourse around migration, whether it's policies intended to attract certain migrants, at the same time policies intended to restrict access for certain migrants. It's an issue that for us here at the Institute for Security Studies, we focus on, not least because of the impact that regulating migration and effective migration governance has for countries. The focus today will be on South Africa's policy and really looking at where it is, where it intends to be, but also really identifying some of the gaps and some of the risks of a risk-based and or securitized approach to migration. I am Otilia Anamaunganidze, and I will be chairing the seminar as well as moderating the discussion afterwards. To my immediate right is Emmanuel Mbiozo, a senior research consultant for the Institute for Security Studies, who during the course of 2018 has conducted research focusing on South Africa's migration policy, issues around the Global Compact on migration, as well as looking at specific voices from the field, including the voices of women migrants in South Africa. To my left is Corey Johnson from the Scalabrini Center, based in Cape Town, who works also on migration issues, but very specifically on issues related to refugees and asylum seekers within the South African context, with a view to assisting them while here in South Africa. The two presenters will cover South Africa's policy as it relates to migration. On the one hand, voluntary migration, and on the other hand, forced migration. It will look at the ways in which South Africa governs migrants coming into South Africa, including sending migrants back home. It will also look at the ways in which South Africa's migration policy can be improved. In 2017, the South African government adopted the South African government's white paper on international migration, which articulates a number of key points to consider in migration governance. Some of those points will come out during the course of the presentation, and others we hope we'll be able to discuss going forward. 2018 is also the year that states are negotiating the Global Compact on safe and regular migration, which is hoped to be adopted in Marrakesh in December of this year. So migration for different reasons is on the agenda. As many of you will know, early last week, the Democratic Alliance released their policy as it relates to illegal or undocumented migrants and the need to secure South Africa's borders. It's important then in having this discussion not to restrict it only to the ways in which the current government in South Africa views migration, but also how it is viewed across the political spectrum. This seminar, this part of the seminar will be live streamed, so I would also like to welcome our online audience. After the presentations, we will close the discussion and bid goodbye to our online audience, and then have a discussion under the Chatham House rule. Before I hand over to Emmanuel, who will speak about South Africa's migration policy, highlight some of the issues around migration into South Africa, I would like to give a special thanks to the Hansado Foundation, without whom this event would not be possible. That being said, I hand over to Emmanuel to talk us through South Africa's migration policy.
Okay. Thank you, Otilia, and welcome everybody. I'll start with a quick snapshot of what migration in South Africa looks like today. It's very difficult to find accurate statistics on exactly who's in South Africa, and some of that has to do with how we measure people when we track them, so upon entry and upon exit, and some of it has to do with the clandestine nature of irregular migration, which means people who have either entered or have stayed illegally. Nonetheless, everybody who does statistics agrees that the sweeping majority of migrants within South Africa are African. The 2011 census puts that number at 68% from SADC countries and 75+% from African countries. The 2016 community survey puts those numbers even higher of migrants coming from Africa. Most are economic, we would term economic migrants from neighboring countries who are entering South Africa to seek work. Migration is very strongly influenced by colonial and apartheid roots, still to this day. We're living in a province here in Gauteng that was very much shaped by predominantly male contract labor. This has decreased substantially in the last decade. So in 2003, 60% of the mining labor force was foreign nationals. And, excuse me, by 2013, that number had gone down to 23%. So what that has resulted in is increases in other kinds of migration. So we're starting to see more irregular, more women and more youth coming in. Work permits, so what we hear often in discourse referred to as legal migrants, are going predominantly to non-African nationals. So out of the top 10 nationalities who receive work permits, 7 are non-African. This lack of un or low-skilled legal work permits is one of the root causes that drives irregular migration. It has been established that there's an extremely strong connection between most of the migrants who come in and their home communities. What we mean by that is a lot of it is circular, so people are coming and going in different degrees. The pathways into South Africa are predominantly, compared to other global areas, inexpensive. Most people are coming in by route, by really popular corridors, using widely available public transportation. Smuggler use compared to some other areas in the world is quite low, and it's mostly used at borders specifically. Borders have been identified as definitely being the most dangerous and volatile places in the migration route, and that's where you're seeing the most smuggler use and the most corruption. One of the issues that we looked at this year is the feminization of migration. So what that means is that we're seeing much significant growth in women migrants coming into South Africa. In 2005, there was just under 500,000 women here in South Africa, and that has tripled by 2017, and we're now looking at about 1.8 million. They make up 44% of the total migrant stock, but the total migrant stock is rising. It's also, we're seeing a shift in how women migrate. So there's much more women are now migrating independently, so coming without a partner or not to meet a partner than we've previously seen. Whereas they make up 44% of the total migrant stock, they make up 33% of the asylum claims in South Africa. For the current South African policy developments, there are many different international and national frameworks that are relevant to migration, but for the purposes of this conversation, we've highlighted a few. One being the 2017 White Paper on International Migration, which Otilia already spoke of. This is the widest available policy platform, and it covers 8 key areas. It's the first white paper since 1999. And as she said, it applies what they've coined as a risk-based approach. The Border Management Authority Bill is also still under consideration, so it's been passed by Parliament and is sitting with the National Council of Provinces. And its emphasis is on consolidating the border environment under the authority of Home Affairs. Again, the emphasis in that bill is on protecting and militarizing the border environment. The Refugees Amendment Act was enacted in December 2017, and this restricts several of the offerings to refugees and asylum seekers, including self-employment, study rights. It also makes additional allowances for cessations, that's a tough word, and exclusions for refugee status. So what we're mainly going to be, now that I've laid the outline of what the current context looks like, we're going to take a look at some of the impacts of these policies. Corey, my colleague, is going to focus largely on asylum seekers and refugees. Well, I'm going to take us a little bit deeper into the impacts on low-skilled Africans coming from neighboring countries and also on women. So looking at the 2017 white paper specifically, there's a lot of really strong and encouraging rhetoric about being Africa-centered. So the white paper has an entire chapter dedicated to speaking about grounding our migration policies in African realities. It claims to prioritize an African agenda. It states that the migration policies in South Africa are not quite aligned with the African-centeredness of the other foreign policies. It claims that it wants to harness the potential of migration, again grounded in African realities, and it concedes that the national economy cannot develop without the region also developing. It admits that migration is inevitable and that migrants do contribute to the national economy. It also admits that there's a lack of pathways for low-skilled and unskilled migrants and that this results in abuse of existing systems. And importantly, it proposes regularization schemes for Africans already in the country and a series of low-skilled visas for SADC residents. A closer look, though, reveals that it's not quite as African-centered as it claims it would be. The first reason being that it overstates problems that are associated with African migrants. One of the key ones being that we're labeling migrants as security threats without the evidence. So one of the quotes, it's quite long, that I've pulled from the white paper, says, "Immigration that is not managed through a risk-based approach is poorly managed immigration. This gives rise to systemic corruption as well as exposing all who live in the country to serious risks such as terrorism and drug smuggling. If risks are not managed, instability will increase and skilled migrants will not be recruited efficiently, thus undermining development. Job opportunities will not expand, and this in turn will generate xenophobia and more instability." I've pulled that one with due respect because it's quite absurd. The conceptual link between these issues is not clear, or is it supported by evidence? And I think that this positioning is quite problematic and tells us a little bit about the efforts to problematize some of the people. We've disproportionately problematized economic migrants abusing asylum systems. So one of the core pieces of the white paper and of all policy positions right now is that asylum seekers and what we're calling economic migrants are posing a disproportionate risk and burden on the systems, even though, again, the evidence doesn't necessarily show that. To use, again, white paper logic, and this is their own description. In 2015, the system captured 15.6 million inward motions into South Africa and only 14.2 departures, which leaves 1.44 million people remaining. It goes on to say that some people go back to their countries, but some overstay, and in most cases apply for asylum to legitimize their stay. In that same year, there was a total of 62,000 asylum claims. So simple math tells us that 62,000 doesn't add up to most of 1.44 million. There's also a concerning cherry picking of the National Development Plan that happens in the white paper. So the National Development Plan very clearly calls for more progressive solutions for low-skilled migrants from neighboring countries, and that's ignored throughout the white paper, but they use it to justify high-skilled recruitment. And there's also some concerning and poor cause and effect correlations that ultimately end up blaming migrants for what are systemic failures within the department. The second concerning way we know that it's not quite as African-centered as we want it to be is that we see in the behavior that's followed, we see a prioritization around restrictive measures. So we've seen, as I've said, some progressive promises that we're waiting to actualize, like the SADC visas or like the visa regularization schemes, and those are currently stalled within the department. But in the meantime, the Border Management Authority bill has been is progressing. The Refugee Amendment Act has been enacted. And asylum processing facilities, which are probably the most controversial proposal in the white paper, there's been a feasibility study conducted, so those are progressing. So while restrictive measures that will disproportionately impact our African neighbors are progressing, the progressive ones appear stalled. And the visa regularization and the SADC visas definitely have the most potential into reducing irregular flows and of giving people regular options. From a perspective of women migrants, we also conducted a study this year that looked at gender mainstreaming of migration. And what we found in that is that South Africa applies a gender-neutral approach. So again, referencing the white paper, it's an 81-page document, and the word women or woman comes up twice. And applying this, it becomes quite clear that a lot of the more restrictive policies are geared towards what maybe in our heads are sort of able-bodied, working-age men with the means and the capacity to go around the system. And a lot of that ends up putting the women in more risk. So a gendered analysis, an intersectional analysis of gender and migration reveals definitely that women encounter elevated risks, and I'm going to list some of them. One is violence. So women migrants are prone to encountering violence all along the migration pathway. So it's often a driver for them to move. They're exposed to it en route and as well at the end. Harmful practices. So many women are escaping harmful practices and often enter into harmful practices like something like forced marriage on arrival as a coping mechanism. Undervalued and unprotected work. So all migrants are susceptible to getting into undervalued and unprotected work, but particularly women find themselves in more informal situations. Exploitation and abuse. 80% of trafficking victims are women, and in particular, undocumented and young women are subject to trafficking. When it comes to papers, women are more likely to be under a man's file, and they're more likely to be less documented and more isolated. When it comes to access to information, women have less information, have been shown to have less information on their rights and their options than men. Access to services. So both men and women migrants struggle with access to services, but women, including healthcare and education, justice, or housing, but women often carry more of a burden, a family burden. So this has a disproportionate impact. When it comes to the family burden, migrants the family burden often changes upon migration, and for women often increases. So a lot of them, let's say, aren't working on departure and then must manage family and everything that goes with it, as well as working on arrival. Gender norms is another thing that is disrupted upon migration. So sometimes women typically migrate to a place with more progressive norms, but sometimes the norms follow them, or they're exposed to new ones on arrival, and that has been shown to lead to high levels of gender-based violence. Remittances is an important component for women migrants. So women remit as much as men migrants, but they do it more regularly and over longer periods of time, and they give up higher amounts of their income. So that means that they're sort of suffering in their own conditions more than their equivalent in male. And finally, an intersectional analysis. So women in South Africa African women in South Africa experience triple discrimination through xenophobia, racism, and misogyny. So some of the recommendations that we'll put forward that I'll end with is that, one, everything that we do when we talk about migration has to recognize the reality that more women are coming and that they're coming alone. So any policies that we develop must recognize this, and they must include a gendered analysis. We have to consider the impact on women as they're more vulnerable. We've seen progress in this department in international frameworks that we haven't quite seen domestically. So we encourage South Africa to try and follow suit with some of the things we're seeing internationally, and to promote rights-based approaches all around. Secondly, similarly, economic migrants will keep coming due to the relative economic strength in South Africa, and because it's human nature to move. So on this front, regularization and visa schemes must be prioritized. They are by far the most robust tool that we have available to bring people out of illegality. The static visas are definitely promising, but they have to make gendered considerations. So for example, we've already identified that women are more likely to work in informal settings than men, so we have to consider that when we develop these programs. And we flat out need to just stop problematizing easy targets, which migrants are. The punitive measures. There's a lot of evidence to show that they don't work. They increase vulnerability and they push people towards illegality, and they don't stop migration. They just change who's coming and how they're getting here. And borders are particularly violent for all migrants, but again, particularly women. And if we're pushing people into illegality, then those vulnerabilities increase. People will still find ways in, and they will be more violent and more risky. One of the interesting findings unintended findings in the research that I did on women was a low abuse of the asylum system. They weren't, by and large, they were more afraid of encountering home affairs than they were to walk in and abuse it. So restrictions that are aimed towards reducing the asylum abuse, they're likely to be made with men in mind and not considering what the impact is on genuinely vulnerable women who need access to those systems. The asylum centers in particular, again, one of the most controversial things to come up in the current policy platform, need to consider the impact on women and on children. The development potential of migration. So we all need to look at how we frame migration and need to work back from the risk-based approach and start looking at the development potential that it has for both our country and for the sending country. And in this, women always need to be included, especially if they're migrating more and they're migrating more alone, and a lot of that is because of their growing economic potential as individuals. The benefits of migration decrease unequivocally when it is irregular. Instead, it feeds corruption and it feeds black markets. So bringing that to the surface and making it legal benefits everyone, including our data experts over here. If we're tracking people, it allows us to know who's coming in, and increasing visa options is not the same as opening borders. It means that there's an inherent security function to providing visas because people are screened and identified and tracked when they come in. Sixth is we must all guard against xenophobia, racism, patriarchy. So policymakers in particular have to recognize the damaging effects across all of society and follow through on the plans that we make to fight each of these. And finally, we have to be really weary of international examples. We're seeing some quite frankly, bad examples in the world. And no other area matches the specifics that we have here in our region. So if we're going to be pulling from in Australia, we have to be very cognizant that our environment is very different from theirs. And warn against those bad practices. And I shall end there.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Emmanuel. As you were speaking, the thing that sort of kept coming to my mind is how important it is to know rather than to assume and to guess. And also, perhaps the one thing that from a policymaker, whether from an advisory point of view or from an actual practitioner point of view, really understanding beyond, I suppose, the figures, some of them which range from anything from 500,000 to 5 million, which makes it extremely difficult even from a policy planning point of view to say, when we are dealing with migrants, these are the people that we're dealing with, because that information is either not there or it's inadequate. So there's a need, I think, from all that you have said, there's also a need to make sure that the accuracy of the data is linked to the actual reality. But one of the things that you did with your research this year, specific to women, was to actually speak to women migrants. Before I turn to Corey, if you could maybe just share some of the stories from the women that you spoke with, and what impact the kind of policy framework we have at the moment in practice has on people. And I will add that the interviews were primarily conducted in the Western Cape, with only women migrants from other parts of the African continent.
Sure. So yes, all of them were African migrants, and all of them were in the Western Cape. Excuse me. I intentionally sought out mixed migrants, so that meant that I wasn't looking at just any one category. I wanted to capture people who came from a variety and who stayed on a variety of needs. And I think, so there was sort of, if I can say, a somewhat even split between people who were trying to get in or were in the asylum and refugee system and people who had arrived irregularly. One of the key findings I already pointed to, which is that of all of the people who had entered or stayed irregular, all of them were scared of Home Affairs or scared of any authority. So the concept that people are intentionally abusing the asylum system, nobody will deny that there's truth to that. But there was a very, very low incidence of that within the study that I did. They would prefer to avoid authority at all lengths. There was so much. There were so many stories. And there was, I think, one of my key points in this presentation has been that the blocking of access to the asylum system as a means of trying to reduce abuse. One of the things that I did see was the impact on truly vulnerable women. So one of the women that I came across had a horrifying story. So she was chased out of Uganda. She was stateless because there was no documentation of her birth, and she was chased out of Uganda, including burning her baby to death. And she made her way into a refugee camp, and so she remains stateless, so she remains undocumented, and she made her way into a refugee camp in Namibia and was there. Their home was set afire again by other refugees, and they were told that they had to go. So they literally crossed the Orange River by foot with 2 babies and made her way down to Cape Town. She's incredibly resourceful, and she's trying to find her way through the system, and she can't get it. So she's been in and out of Home Affairs a million times. She's destitute. She's got 2 children who are showing signs of malnutrition and poor development, and she can't get help because people, when you frame asylum seekers as fraudsters that are trying to take advantage of the system, that plays out against people like her. So there's a xenophobia that happens at both the community and at the institutional level. And that came out a lot through all the interviews as well, is that a lot of people experience it from individuals in their communities, but then they say that the worst that they're experiencing it is within Home Affairs or within the police department when they go to get help and people refuse them, or within the hospitals. And I think that's, again, one of institutionalized xenophobia. That's the really sad side of all of this, is that there are genuinely highly vulnerable people who can't get help right now. If it weren't for churches, she would, I don't know, be dead maybe? I'm not sure. And for a country that's trying to uphold a human rights record, that's not a proud story. That's not something that we should be doing. And, even if it prevents a couple of other people. And I think the idea that we're seeing this dialogue happen internationally, that we're being overwhelmed by migrants coming in and they're overwhelming the system. Well, that's not what the numbers show. And I think Corey will be able to speak to this more closely, but I think last year's numbers are about 35,000 asylum seekers.
26, I think.
26,000. So this is not a population that's overwhelming the other 55 million of us to abuse our systems. And if there's a fraction of it that is, to pour all of our energy onto it it's just not that smart. And I don't think at a cost, I don't think that reflects our national priorities.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Emmanuel. I felt, especially in a conversation around policy, that sometimes we forget that policies are crafted for people. yes, they're crafted by people, that the policies are crafted for people, whether it is to protect them, whether it is to advance their rights, that ultimately it's stories such as the ones that you were told during the course of your research that ought to be informing the way in which we engage. So whether it is a risk-based approach, whether it is a securitized approach, or whether it's a rights-based approach, to recognize that that policy and that practice will impact and can have a positive impact, but can also have a negative impact, not on anything other than humans. And perhaps that's the main message. Emmanuel, beyond sort of doing your research, and the people in the room will have a copy, but produced a policy brief which really speaks to the ways in which, from a constructive point of view, the ways in which South Africa's migration policy can better be aligned with its African vision, because that African vision does exist, and it is about ensuring that then what we say in rhetoric is seen in practice and is seen in policy. With that, I'm going to hand over to Corey. You deal mostly with people that are seeking asylum or people that have already been granted their refugee status. If you can, talk us through a lot of that, some of the experiences, but also your experience as an advocacy officer for the Scalabrini Center.
Okay, thank you. Thanks everyone for coming, and thanks for watching online. My name is Corey Johnson, and I'm at the advocacy program at the Scalabrini Center of Cape Town. We are an NGO that assists refugees and migrants with local integration as well as citizens, and we do it through a variety of programs. I'm with the advocacy program, providing paralegal advice and advocacy efforts. There's also an English school, an employment access program, a diversity training program in area schools, a welfare program, and a women's platform program as well. So we try to kind of address migration and forced migration holistically. And what I'll try to push through today is how, kind of build on what Emmanuel said earlier, in that the kind of imbalance between the Refugees Act and the Immigration Act over the last 10, 15 years is kind of lent itself to asylum seekers, refugees being portrayed as fraudsters and bogus, and how that kind of perception filters its way through all parts of the process when somebody's applying for asylum or attempting to apply for asylum. So the Refugees Act, passed in 1998, is a really progressive piece of legislation. It's a rights-based approach to refugee protection, relying heavily on local integration. So an asylum seeker can come into the country, claim asylum, and reside in local communities and continue a somewhat normal life, which is a lot different than other contexts on the continent. And while we talk about the problems a lot, when the Refugees Act does work, it works beautifully. And there's a lot of people who have been able to find protection and continue to live their lives in dignity. At this point, I believe it's around 120,000 recognized refugees, so people who've gone through the system and been recognized formally by Home Affairs. And you can see this from Somalis fleeing the civil war there that's been going since 1991, the Angolans also fleeing that civil war, and a lot of different countries as well. So when it works, it does work. And I think what the primary problem has been is that the Immigration Act doesn't cater to the regional context. And the result is that a lot of people are channeled into the asylum system who lodge applications. Some of them do so knowing that they won't qualify. Others have no idea if they qualify or not. There's a lot of misinformation around the asylum process. But what that has done is, over the years, made the refugee system be implemented in more of an immigration control approach. And it's been focused on reducing numbers, primarily, and abuse. So what I'm going to try to do is speak through how that affects legitimate refugees. So the advocacy program at the Scalabrini Center, we see about 2,000 people a year, and they are primarily from the DRC, around 40 to 45% of our clients. About a third are from Somalia, and the next highest figure I think is Burundi, around 15% roughly. So these are people who really need the refugee system, and they're really struggling to get the protection that they are seeking. So how has asylum been framed in recent years? I have a few printouts on everyone's chair, and the first one to take a look at would be the slide that shows a person by the name of Max. So this is a slide from November 2011 that was presented in Parliament to a special joint committee by the then Director General of Home Affairs. And you can see how they are framing the asylum system as this person coming into the country, bribery, fraudulent application for asylum, a fraudulent marriage, runs a shop with links to the illicit economy, impacts on society, the economy, and so on and so forth. Eventually this person becomes a citizen even. So that's kind of how the asylum seeker is being portrayed, I think. It is not somebody seeking refuge from Burundi or Somalia. It is the fraudster, somebody coming into the country illegitimately and with links to crime. So I guess the question is, how does this translate into practice? And the first major point I'd like to make is that what's kind of developed is a bit of an autonomous bureaucracy within Home Affairs. And a lot of it is kind of focused on the immigration control aspect because all of the applicants are fraudsters and illegitimate. So it's really become more of an immigration control tool than anything. And there's a lot of literature out there on this, especially from Wits University and people like Darshan Vinaswaran, Lauren Landau, Ronnie Amit. If you're interested in reading about that, I'd encourage you to check those authors out. I'm sure I'm forgetting a few. But so what's happened is there's kind of an autonomous bureaucracy that kind of diverges from the Progressive Refugees Act and tries to create obstacles that will hinder someone's access to the system. And we see this a lot throughout the whole process, starting from entering the country all the way to inside the refugee reception offices. So at the border, you are encouraged to enter the country lawfully and regularly through a border post. You can apply to get a transit visa through Section 23 of the Immigration Act, commonly called a transit visa or a transit permit. This allows you 5 days to then proceed to a refugee reception office and formally lodge your claim for asylum. But what we see at the border is that these aren't issued in any sort of consistent manner. And a lot of it has to do with how officials are viewing asylum seekers as illegitimate. Stats are very hard to come by on this, but there was a newspaper article a few years ago where Minister Gagaba noted that some of the problems at the border posts, and he said something roughly along the lines of that those problems boil down to the attitudes of officials. And it's not the position of government, but it's the officials doing it themselves. So he's kind of acknowledging that the problems we're having there are somewhat attributable to the individual attitudes of officials. There was a report done in Parliament on borderland security, and when that research team visited the Messina border post, they found that there had been 0 transit permits issued in the previous 6 months. And that's the busiest port of entry into the country. And in 2015, I'm trying to think of how many asylum applications there were, but certainly 35,000 at least. There might have been a little more in that period of time. But 0 permits were issued. So obviously something's going on there. And what it forces asylum seekers to do is enter irregularly. they're going to have to jump the border. They'll have to do a number of things. And that kind of, we'll come back to this later when we talk about the Refugees Amendment Act, but it's kind of the first problem, the first step. So these problems follow the asylum seeker all the way to the Refugee Reception Office, where they go and try to lodge their claim for asylum. There are a few court cases that detail some of the practices that have been implemented at refugee reception offices over the years to kind of limit the number of applicants or channel people away from the asylum process. If you're interested in looking in those would be the Tafira and Killico cases. So it goes from that, which is kind of a policy in place at the Refugee Reception Office, but it also goes down to kind of more informal, smaller obstacles like a lost file. If an asylum seeker's file is lost, they're going to then be told to come back until they find it. They'll remain undocumented for a period of time. It can also result in corruption. Corruption has been an endemic part of the asylum system, unfortunately, for many years. And there's a 2015 report out also from Wits University about that, finding corruption at all points of the asylum process. And what this does is it makes the system inefficient. People are being told to come back some other time. They're returning again. They know that they need that permit to be valid, to live a somewhat normal life, to access services, to conduct work. So they're returning again, and the numbers there at the refugee office are, they swell, and there's maybe not a way for the office to assist them, so they go away, they're frustrated. And that brings me to the second handout I have, which is a copy of a Section 22 permit. So it's I'm sure you'll notice it. It's the one with the somebody's details of their asylum permit. And if you look at this, you can see that even through the copy, you can see it's a tattered and worn permit when we made the copy. And the person in the upper left-hand corner, you can see a few file numbers. They've been blacked out for anonymity, but the last two digits of a person's file number generally correspond with when they applied for asylum. This particular file shows a 2003 file in the Bromfontein Refugee Reception Office in Johannesburg, and a secondary one of Crown Mines Refugee Office in Johannesburg in 2009. So either way, they either applied originally in 2003 or perhaps they were accompanied by a parent. That person has been in the system a long time. You can see the permit on the right-hand side of the permit, just below the picture, expired, I think, in 2016. And if you go further down, you can see the number of extensions on the permit. And I think this one has 15 extensions. So that person had been back at least 15 times, probably more. It sometimes resets itself. But the more troubling part is on the very back of the copy is a bunch of stamps from Home Affairs. So this person has been trying to renew their permit, but they've just been getting a stamp on the back. So on the system, it would show that their permit is expired. Whereas if you look at their expired copy of their permit, you can see these stamps, and you can see that they've been trying to at least gain some assistance. So when we're talking about statistics and trying to get accurate data, this person would come off as somebody who's no longer active in the system, whereas in fact over a period of years they've been trying to have their permit renewed. And so what this practically means for someone is repeated trips to the refugee reception office. It means they can't legally work. It means they're going to have trouble accessing services. So it really pushes them into kind of a legal gray area, kind of a liminal position somewhere between a documented asylum seeker, but maybe not quite full rights to work. Employers don't really know how to treat these permits. And it's this sort of practice that really, I think, makes conditions more broadly a lot more insecure, actually. So while a lot of these sort of practices are under the guise of we need a risk-based approach and we need to enhance security, in effect, actually, it's fostering conditions for exploitation and fostering conditions for corruption. So that's another part of what we're seeing. Another major obstacle, especially from Cape Town, has been the closure of the Refugee Reception Office to new applicants. So the refugee system since 2011 has had 3 offices closed. The Johannesburg office closed entirely. The Port Elizabeth office closed to new applicants, meaning if you were to show up in Port Elizabeth and want to apply, you can't lodge a claim. You'd have to travel to one of the remaining offices. And the same thing in Cape Town. Cape Town was closed in 2012, Port Elizabeth in 2011. So what we are seeing is a lot of people end up in Cape Town wanting to apply for asylum. They've just come from a long journey. They didn't know that the office was closed. And now they are faced with this 1,000-kilometer journey to try to apply for asylum in Pretoria, Musina, or Durban. So this has really kind of hindered access to the system, and it's really reduced capacity. And even now, at the moment, we had some individuals who wanted to apply for asylum in Durban, and they were told they should come back in 2019 to lodge their claim because they've been booked out. So we're really seeing a reduction in capacity, and the geographic spread of it opens up a whole nother level of vulnerability, people traveling across the country to places maybe they don't know anyone or are unfamiliar with. And so that's another major issue. And then lastly, the refugee status determination processes. So the Refugees Act provides for an individualized determination on whether someone is has legitimate refugee protection needs or not. And this would be the third handout, which is the decision of one of these hearings. So there's a lot of research on the shortcomings of this process, and again done by Wits University, Ronnie Amit in particular, which found widespread errors of law, irrelevant considerations, and just almost mass-produced rejection letters. So the one you're seeing is a Somali applicant in 2017 who's applied for asylum and was rejected as fraudulent. You can see on the claim, which is on the first page, what he supposedly fled. There's 2 sentences about conflict and civil war. And then the decision says that he's based his application on based on facts that aren't reasonable. I can't quite remember what it says exactly, but you can look. And that's just one example of kind of how these things have been conducted. Part of it is a capacity issue. The RSDOs, the officials in charge, are tasked with doing this. They have high targets to hit. It's a stressful job, and it's not the easiest job either. But what we're seeing is kind of just a mass rejection of individuals like this. So I have a few statistics from last year. Last year, 2017, this is from the Department of Home Affairs, there were 25,713 rejections, and there were 2,267 approvals. But out of the approvals, 1,788 were flagged as family reunification. So that would mean if a recognized refugee had a daughter or son, they would join the file. So that leaves us with 479 people who were recognized in a first instance interview. So that's a percentage of about 2%, 1.9%. So that's a really high rejection rate. And what that does is it pushes a lot of the pressure onto the review and appeal process. At the moment, the appeal board has a backlog of around 133,000 cases as of 2017 to go through. That's a lot, and they're really under a lot of pressure to hear cases. Again, it's not an easy job. But what that practically means is that people are going to be put into protracted temporary legal status for a long period of time. We routinely see people in the system for 10 years or more. And what that means then at the refugee office, the continual have to run the gauntlet of get your permit renewed and all the rest. So if there's any sort of traveling to Pretoria or Musina, it gets more difficult, and we see a lot of people end up with expired permits. Okay, so then that's kind of where we're at. So on the whole, we're seeing a lot of people being rejected and being placed into temporary status for a long period of time. But over the years, we're actually seeing a reduction in the number of asylum applications, yet the rejection rate stays high. Like I showed you with the Somali individual, there's people from refugee-producing countries who are rejected out of hand quite commonly. Noel sort of kind of spoke about the legislative developments, and I'm just going to talk a little bit about the Refugee Amendment Act, which was signed into law last December, but hasn't entered into force yet because regulations haven't been promulgated and published as of yet. Home Affairs has released a draft version for public comment last June, I think, so it'll probably go into effect sometime before the end of the financial year. And I'm just going to focus on a few key parts of the Amendment Act. There's a few positive developments, I think. They've introduced some measures to combat corruption, for example, and it's also introduced some measures to make the appeal process more flexible and a little more efficient. So that's positive. The question is, will it be implementable? Will we be able to deal with that backlog with these changes? I'm not so sure about that, but it's a step in the right direction. More worryingly, though, are the introduction of some new measures to exclude applicants. You could be excluded for refugee status if you have run afoul of some administrative requirements. So a few of the key ones are, if you don't report to a refugee reception office within 5 days, you can be excluded, because that is how Home Affairs is setting up the system. If we're seeing what's happening in Durban, if we're seeing the kind of ambiguity between the closures in Port Elizabeth and Cape Town, which were both found unlawful, and Home Affairs has been ordered to reopen them. Port Elizabeth just reopened on Monday, so we'll see how things go there, but Cape Town is still closed. So what we're seeing is people are kind of confused about where to apply for asylum, how are they going to do it. If you can do it in 5 days, if you can report to an RO within 5 days, I think that's a tall order, and I don't think many people will be able to meet that criteria. Another exclusion is if you enter the country irregularly. So when we discussed earlier the transit visa problems, if you don't have a transit visa and you can't prove you entered the country through a port of entry, then you can possibly be excluded from refugee status. Both of these will come down to the discretion of an RSDO, the same individuals who are making the determinations. So they will be able to say if your reasons for not getting a transit permit are justified or not. Given the problems we've seen in the determination process, we're very concerned about how that will actually go into force. Another restriction is about the right to work. So the Amendment Act introduces a new kind of sustainability determination process where you will be assessed if you can support yourself for 4 months. If you can't support yourself for 4 months, then you will be referred to UNHCR or another charitable organization for support, or a family friend. So somebody who would say, yes, I can support this person for 4 months. If neither of those options are possible, then you might be able to receive the right to work pending the approval of finding work and then bringing the letter confirming you're employed back to a refugee reception office. So that excludes people who are going to work informally or be self-employed, and that's running counter to a high court case from a few years ago, the Limpopo Trader case, involving the right to self-employment. It's also kind of running, there's some tension there with the Wachanuka judgment from 2003, which found that if the only means to sustain yourself is the right to work, it can't be limited because it would result in you living in indignity. So we're not sure how this will be implemented. But Lastly, the last concerning thing is if your permit is expired for 30 days or more, you will have your application be considered abandoned, and then you won't be able to resume it. There will be a bit of a proviso. The Standing Committee for Refugee Affairs will be able to determine if you've got just cause for allowing your permit to expire, but it adds another layer of determination and decision-making into the asylum process. And all these things aren't really connected to the main point of it, which is humanitarian protection, but it's adding more duties, more layers to the process. And on a system that's already taxed quite a bit, not quite sure if that's really going to be implementable in any kind of reasonable manner or efficient way. So I guess to sum up then, will the Amendment Act, increase efficiency? Is it going to allow us to determine who has refugee needs or not? Is it going to address the problems of implementation over the last 15 years or so? We don't know yet, but it's very concerning from our perspective. I think if there's something to be hopeful for, and to follow up on what was said earlier, the regularization projects in the white paper are a step in the right direction, as well as the SADC visa regime. A lot of that will come down to how they're implemented, if they're done in a transparent and open way, if they're not overly restrictive with strict time limits, with requirements that people just can't meet. Those can be really helpful tools. It could also really help the asylum system and the reopening of the Cape Town Refugee Reception Office and the Port Elizabeth office to make those systems work a little more effectively. But again, the concern is that the damage has been done, and that the asylum seeker still remains the illegitimate applicant, the bogus applicant, and that whatever happens on the immigration side doesn't necessarily mean improved conditions for refugees or asylum seekers. And I think that wraps up what I have to say.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Corey, for disentangling what is otherwise for a lot of people quite a complicated and often confusing system and processes in terms of dealing with people that are seeking asylum, and then thereafter people that are granted refugee status, if at all they're granted that status. I think by giving us some of the key examples, whether it is a person's permit or a person's application and the rejection thereof, and the reasons given, even if they are from Somalia, which is a country that many know and recognize as a country that is in conflict and that has been in conflict for 30 years. It's something that I think having those tangible tools to be able to see what it really is for people who we would consider by their nature to be vulnerable people, then going through a system that might not necessarily fully acknowledge their vulnerability. Between yourself, Corey, and Emmanuel, you've sort of captured the extent of the South African migration policy framework. On the one hand, focusing a lot in terms of those people that we consider to be voluntary migrants, so people who pack their bags at home and voluntarily travel to South Africa, either already having a study permit, a work permit, or coming on holiday, or staying. But also looking at the spectrum of those people who also want to be voluntary migrants, but for whom the system is restrictive and makes it difficult for them to do so. And I think both of you, whether you're speaking about voluntary migrants or people forced to flee their homes to seek refuge elsewhere, recognizing how important it is for at border management level, whether it is at a port of entry, a land port of entry, sea port of entry, or air port of entry, that though the people that work in those institutions not only recognize the varying needs of people migrating, but also that the process is more human-centered, while recognizing, and I think it's important to underscore this, while recognizing that national security and national interest are issues that do have to be dealt with and that do have to be effectively managed. So not to do it at the expense of national security, but to recognize that the more we know who is in the country, the more individuals are documented, the easier it ultimately is to be able to advance that national security agenda. For a field where a lot of data remains unknown, or a field where some of the available data is unreliable, or even where it is reliable, not relied upon, I think it's worth capturing some of the realities from both your presentations. So first, there are South African realities. So before we go into the migrant realities, there are some South African realities that I think ought to be understood and underscored in the conversation about anyone, be they South African or from a migrant community within the country's borders. South Africa is a country that still has to deal with the challenge of inequality, socioeconomic as well as personal inequality. It is a country where the majority of people, according to Statistics South Africa, live in varying degrees of poverty, with over 50% of those people having been in a state of poverty for most of their life. South Africa is a country where the unemployment rate for the country is alarmingly high. Bearing in mind, then, it's also a country that is a growing country, where the median age is 26, which means when we speak about unemployment, we are speaking about young people being unemployed and young people needing employment. South Africa is a country that still has to deal with issues related to crime and violence, whether it is interpersonal violence or violence and crime related to opportunistic violence, such as the increase in house robberies that was noted by the South African Minister of Police in releasing the crime statistics for this calendar year and in previous years. It is also a country where people need to access services and need to access resources, but that is struggling to ensure that everyone receives the basic services that they need, whether it's water, whether it's toilets that can flush, whether it's schools that are now and enable that students feel that they're dignified within those spaces as they learn, whether it's having roads that access the many communities that aren't here in Tshwane where we have a built environment, but communities that live in many respects on the margins of society when there shouldn't be margins of society. Those are realities here. And then we speak about the migration realities. Who are the people that are coming to South Africa? And Menowell noted in her presentation that 75% of the people migrating towards South Africa come from sub-Saharan Africa, with over 60% of the total coming from within the SADC region. So those are Southern African countries. That means you would presume then that people who get visas into South Africa are predominantly African. The reality is the reverse. The majority of people that receive visas and therefore can regard themselves as regular migrants within the South African space are in fact non-African, with the 7 majority countries receiving visas not being on the African continent. This is a continent, mind you, with 56 states. They do not make up the majority of people who receive visas. The question then is, what of Africans that are genuinely seeking employment? What of Africans that can contribute, whether it is in the mining sector where less than 10 years ago, African miners made up 60%, and now the number has gone to below a third. What then of people who genuinely want to make a contribution, but are unable, either due to restrictive policies, to apply for a legitimate permit? What then of people who become undocumented and make it an even harder task to deliver services? If you think the country has 55 million people, but the reality is that it has 62 million people, how do you effectively plan and manage urban spaces, which are the areas where the majority of migrants go to? How do you ensure that service delivery in those areas cover those people? How do you ensure, for example, where we have issues related to healthcare? How do you ensure from a public health point of view that the services offered to citizens are services equally offered to other people? Because the one thing that disease does not do is discriminate. So if healthcare services are only offered to citizens, but there's an outbreak, let's say of cholera, let's say of typhoid, let's be extreme. How then, if those people cannot get access to healthcare, how do you manage what could be an epidemic? And then we have the issues that relate to specific category of migrating people, the people who, in terms of the Geneva Conventions, ought to be protected in full, the people who are seeking asylum because home is simply not safe enough for them to remain, the people here on the African continent, as you point out, Corey, that are coming from the Democratic Republic of the Congo, that are coming from Somalia, that are coming from Burundi, that could be coming from as further afield as South Sudan. How do you ensure that the system protects them against what violence they left home? How do you ensure that it doesn't further violate their rights, and that those people that are genuinely fleeing conflict can say that South Africa is a place where you can seek refuge, not where you can hide, but where you can seek refuge, and if you're able to work, the better, that you are not a drain on service, on free services that should be accessed by the most vulnerable. How do you ensure that the system doesn't further discriminate or victimize people that are already victims? So you've covered the range of those issues. And I think the one thing that we can all agree, regardless of who the migrant is we can all agree that migration in South Africa is a complex issue. It's also an issue that lends itself to volatility. In May of 2008, we had flare-ups of violence against African nationals as well as people from South Asia, commonly dubbed as xenophobic violence. Violence that led to dozens of people dying. But the stories that are often not told are of the people that were displaced as a result of that violence, people that have not gone back home. In April of 2015, we had similar flares-up of violence. The allegation being we need to get these people out. If they're not stealing our jobs, they're perpetrating crime. If they're not perpetrating crime, they're taking away from what South Africans ought to have. Bearing in mind that we are in a rainbow nation, a nation that seeks to advance inclusive development, a nation that seeks to advance a society that is, if our emblem is anything to go by, unified in that diversity. All of those things being the realities that I think we ought to map out and that we ought to reflect on. Fundamentally, and I'll end here, a policy approach that helps to advance South Africa's developmental potential is a good policy approach. What then needs to be done is to effectively weigh what do we need to ensure security, what do we need to ensure safety, what do we need to ensure stability, because if we have a secure, safe and stable society, we can have, hopefully, we can be able to achieve that economic potential. Having violence, inequality, poverty, unemployment, crime, and corruption won't ensure that development, regardless of who is responsible. And so with that, I want to thank everyone who's here for joining us, but to give a special thanks to the people who do the harder work. Emmanuel, who spends a lot of her time speaking to people, understanding their perspectives on migration, understanding what challenges they're facing with a view to shaping good policies. So thank you for your research and having us and making it available to us, but also then hoping that it's a tool that is used to improving policy. To Corey, who works on making sure that people who are seeking asylum actually get it. To making sure that an otherwise cold and frustrating system and process is not so. Even if it is, like you guys do at the Scalabrini Center, teaching people English, which might seem a basic thing, but we live in a society where if you're unable to communicate in one of the 11 official languages, it affects your way or your ability to be able to access services, to be able to integrate into a society. So thank you for your presentations, but also for the work that you do. I'd also like to thank again the Hansaido Foundation for letting it be possible for us to even do any of this work. The Hansaido Foundation not only funds the Institute for Security Studies research on migration, but also on issues related to African futures and innovation, related to responding effectively to crime and violence within the South African society, and to improving policing. But it also funds the work that is done by the Scalabrini Center and ensuring that people who can't speak English can. And ultimately that laws such as the Border Management Authority Bill are given the right level of attention and that they actually benefit the people in South Africa. I say that and not South African citizens because South Africa is a country for all those who live within it, as per our Constitution. And then I would like to thank the audience for your attention, whether you made your way here to Tshwane to sit with us for the seminar, but also those of you who are online, who are tuned in. Thank you for joining in a conversation that I think is a critical conversation. We will be having a Chatham House discussion about some of the points that were raised with the people who made it here. So a plea to the online audience, next time, if you are able to, not that you must, but if you are able to make your way to our offices, please do so, because these conversations for us are extremely important. I will end by thanking the members of our partnership forum, of whom the Hansaido Foundation is a part, but also the European Union and the governments of Australia, Canada, Denmark, Finland, Ireland, the Kingdom of the Netherlands, Norway, Sweden, and the United States of America, without whose funds this event and the work that we do here at the Institute would not be possible. So, thank you. And if you can join me in giving Emmanuel and Corey a final round of applause for the work that they're doing.